We have the great pleasure to be starting the Chumash once again. This week we'll be reading the second Torah portion called Noach. Everybody knows the story of Noah. It's interesting that I once saw somebody write that in most cultures, everybody's got a story of a flood that they've seen on caves and so on with other cultures where there's always a story of a flood. Somehow, a story of flood, I guess they try to dismiss the biblical account that, hey, don't worry, if you have any grouping of people, any nation, you're always going to have a flood story. But that being what it is, we really do have a flood story, and it's the story of Noah. I'm going to focus on not so much about Noach's success and failures in trying to influence and change people's lives. I'd like to get to the core, because at the end of the day, Noach did face a formidable problem. He was commissioned in a way to change the moral behavior of the people around him. And yet, unfortunately, as we know, the commentaries tell us that he didn't really succeed, because no one else really ended up in the Teva, in the ark with him. Some commentaries actually tell us that that's why it's referred to as Mei Noach, the waters of Noah, which is really not a nice thing to say. It's like Nebuch, Yankel's hurricane. Like it's Yankel's fault that it's a hurricane. The waters of Noah. But some would say that while he certainly was not the cause for the bringing of the flood, he couldn't or didn't do anything to be able to stop it after 120 years. And therefore, it somehow will forever, eternally bear a mark upon him by having the waters being called the waters of Noah. Anyways, he himself was a single upright person in a very morally corrupt society. And when you think about it, as ethics of our fathers tell us, it was only 10 generations from the creation of the world until Noah. And why is that so important? Because at the end of the day, Noah, when the world started, Adam had a personal relationship with God. Well, it's true that he messed up with one particular commandment and he only had one commandment, but nonetheless, it wasn't morally corrupt. As we know that God ultimately, at the end of the day, he brought about the flood because people were stealing from each other, money, spouses, there was debauchery, it was a murder and theft. And God ultimately brought the destruction because people simply were behaving so ill and terrible towards each other. So God tells Noah, I want you to build a big ark. It's going to take you 120 years, and let's see if you can influence anyone to change their ways. Now, what is the lesson from Noah? The lesson from Noah could be two things. One, no matter what the world looks like, don't be like everyone else. That's lesson number one. You have to live a moral life. The other lesson is that while not being successful, he was expected by God to influence others. Now, what's interesting is there an advantage? Now, Torah, we know, Noach is not even Jewish. Adam is not Jewish, but it's part of our Torah. It's part of a lesson for us. So if there is a lesson for us that we have to live moral lives and that we are expected to be an influence on the people around us, why do we have to learn that from Noah? As a Jewish people, why couldn't have God started this story from Abraham, who's the first patriarch, the first father of the Jewish people, Sarah being the first mother of the Jewish people. And we know that Abraham really has a similar story. Maybe not as intense, but he himself led a moral life when his surroundings suggested otherwise. They were all idol worshippers. I'm sure they were not, the Torah doesn't emphasize that, but we know that they were grabbing Sarah away, kings with ill intentions on their mind. So why don't we, as Jews, learn the lesson that we're meant to stay sound and safe and morally upright, and also be an influence from Abraham, who is our father, and Sarah, who's our mother. Why do we have to learn it from Noah? What is the advantage of learning it from Noah? And the simple response would be that Noah, precisely because he wasn't Jewish, for us has an additional lesson. And that additional lesson means that when we say that we are meant to be a light upon the nations, it means that we're meant to not only influence our fellow Jews to behave correctly, but we also have to educate others to be proper and correct and upright. But while we can easily take note of that difference of learning the lesson from Noah versus learning it from Abraham, there is a problem. If somebody says, by the way, I want you to come and learn this profession from me. And then I'm a potterer. And I watch you 100 times, and you've attempted to make a fruit bowl, a ceramic fruit bowl 100 times, and every time you're about to finish, it breaks. So I ask him, why am I learning by you? Well, the only thing you can say is, well, learn what not to do. I haven't taught you yet what to do, but I've broken something 100 times. Maybe that's, what are we meant to learn from Noah? He wasn't successful. So is there something in the story of Noah as well that, number one, gives us a broader responsibility to the world? And how actually do we influence others? What is it that Noah maybe was missing, or maybe just wasn't, whatever the answer is, we just have to reflect upon ourselves. What is it that we can take away and say, by the way, there is an approach that could possibly work? Now, we know that Judaism, when we say a light upon the nations, we know that Jews don't believe in proselytizing. I've told this multiple times. God nor the Torah wants everyone to be Jewish. If God wanted everyone to be Jewish, he would have created only Jews. God knows what he's doing. He can do it. Like if God only wanted white people, he would have created white people. If God wanted only Orientals, he would have created Orientals. If God only wanted dark skin, he would have created dark skin. So since God created people other than Jews, it's because the whole entire world wasn't meant to be Jewish. God did create humanity and clearly demonstrated that even before the first Jew came about, which, by the way, the failure of the human race may have also been part of the reason why God decided that let me find an individual in a small tribe to be able to be a little bit different. But it clearly, from the story of Noah, wanting them to behave, clearly demonstrates that God had a human moral code that was intended for everybody. For those of us that are familiar, we know that we do have something called the 7 Noahide laws. Repeat, 7 Noahide. It's for the children of Noah. Now, the truth is, these 7 Noahide laws existed before the time of Noah. 6 of them existed in the times of Adam already, from the time of Adam. A 7th was added because of the story of the flood and the ark, which I'll explain in a moment. And therefore, all of them together were already called the 7 Noahide laws. And don't forget that at the end of the day, since the world was destroyed, technically speaking, everybody else became a descendant from Noah and not necessarily descended from Adam, even though Noah himself comes from that. So 2 reasons. Number 1, the world started again from Noah, thus the 7 Noahide laws, and plus a 7th was added because of Noah and the story of the flood. The Rambam Maimonides, he gives a listing of the 7 commandments. He says, these are the prohibitions of worshiping false gods, cursing God, murder, incest and adultery, theft, and the command to establish courts of justice themselves to ensure the adherence to these laws. Then 1 more was added. Maimonides says, the prohibition against eating flesh from a living animal. Why? Because eating meat was not allowed until then. The world were vegetarians. And only because Adam took care of the animals that God gave him permission that he can thereby now partake of animal flesh. But you cannot partake of flesh with its life, which is its blood. So you'd have to properly kill the animal before partaking. This was the 7th, and together the 7 mitzvot, the 7 commandments to all of humanity. Now, many of them are what we would call basic laws by which we can ensure a sane, safe community. Without these laws, you break up the very fiber as the people were experiencing before the flood, where the very fiber of people being safe, living with other people was uncertain. So as being a light upon the nations, if we want to influence Jews, then we have to influence them to adhere and observe 613 commandments. But in order to be a light upon the nations, we have at least a responsibility to educate and promote these ethical values. Why? Because clearly God commanded Moses, as we to accept the commandments given to Noah's descendants, and that halachic obligation then becomes a personal obligation to each and every single one of us. I'll tell you an interesting note that when I was a yeshiva boy, the Rebbe began to have farbrengens where the Rebbe started to publicize this obligation that we have to influence the other nations. It was unique. Which other Jewish leaders were so busy trying to influence our own to behave properly, and now the Rebbe is adding on the mix. No, you also have to influence non-Jews. The Rebbe said that why people might think that I'm saying something novel, but the truth of the matter is that until now, Jews were almost never in a position to be an influence to the nations. We were forced to live in ghettos. We were trying to survive just to live and to make a living. But today you have Jews that can have businesses that employ thousands of people. It's a whole different world, a game changer. You have Jews that live in a land that's their own almost. A game changer. I remember hearing from Rabbi Manis Friedman once that when the Rebbe started to publicize this idea that we have an obligation to non-Jews also, so he would always say that when you come into a taxi, when you go into a taxi after arriving in an airport, for a Chabadnik, it's like, hello, how are you? You Jewish? Jewish. Do you put on tefillin? Have you ever experienced a Shabbos? and this, because you have to, yeah, I got tefillin in my carry-on. Would you like to stop when we stop at my destination? Would you like to put on tefillin? Can I invite you for a Shabbos? Can I connect you to Chabad Rabbi? So you're always on duty. He says there was a time in a Chabadnik's life when you got into a taxi after arriving in an airport, and you built up the courage and finally asked the taxi driver, "Are you Jewish?" And he said, "No, I'm Christian." You say, "Oh, shoot, good. At least I can have 40 minutes from JFK to Crown Heights, a little peace. I could just read my own, and I don't have to be on call." But then the Rebbe started to say about 7 Noahide laws. Now it's like, you're not Jewish, you're Christian. You really have to believe in one God, there's no Trinity here, so you're always on call. So it's plainly obvious that according to the Rambam, that if we're in a position of influence, that our influence extends even to the nations of the world. And we can only learn that, the only story really in the Torah that precedes Jews, where that maybe influence was missing, telling us that it should have been there, is the story of Noah. That's why we can learn it from him, because Noah wasn't Jewish. But again, we go back to the original question. We now know what our obligation is. What's the magical formula to help people understand and appreciate what their lives should be about? Okay, so we're going to start off with something simple that applies to Jews and non-Jews alike. And it comes from the book of Genesis that we read last week. God created the human being in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. First starts off with a male, and then male and female, because obviously the male was created first. So, why is this important? Why is God telling us this? Well, the first thing is that if you know that you're created in the image of God, it should change the way that you look at yourself and the way that you look at others. It's not just an interesting fact. It should be fundamental and foundational, so that it should change the entire way that you look at yourself. In fact, we have something pretty amazing. In Ethics of Our Fathers, in chapter 3, this is a statement. It says, Hu Haya Omer, used to say, but it's a reference to Rabbi Akiva, who was mentioned before. Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem, Chiba Yiseir Nadas Lai Shenivra B'Tselem. Rabbi Akiva used to say, humans are cherished, Chaviv, cherished, for they were created in the image of God. As an even greater sign of love, God let humanity know that they were created in his image. It's one thing God could have said, I created the humans in his image. I didn't have to tell them. But then in the Torah, God says, by the way, I'm letting you know. It's not enough that I'm creating you with the capacity. I want you to know how special you are. And it is clear, as some of the commentaries on the Mishnayos tell us, someone who I just mentioned in the shul not too long ago, actually by, I think it was my Yisker speech, of Yom Tov Lippman Heller, who lived in the 1500s and 1600s. He says clearly that the Mishnah that we just mentioned in the name of Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Akiva referring to all people, not just Jews. Why? Because Rabbi Akiva wanted to empower all people, Jews and non-Jews alike. And he continues, Rabbi Heller, that we ought to influence them with words, draw their hearts towards their Creator, mention their goodness, and instill in their hearts that as bearers of God's image, because God wanted them to know that, they are cherished and possess an internal moral compass. So clearly, when Rabbi Akiva is saying this Mishnah in Ethics of Our Fathers, he doesn't mean only Jews. And why is God telling us that we were created in His image? Because it's important for us to know it. Why is it important for us to know it? Because if we know it, we would appreciate how loved and cherished we are by God. But what does it mean to be created in God's image? We certainly know it doesn't mean physical, because Maimonides at the very beginning of his magnum opus says clearly that God doesn't have an image, doesn't have a body, doesn't have physical entities like we have. But rather, it refers to the human capacity for intellect. That would be our first approach of the many commentators, that it's our intellectual soul. The famous commentary, Rabbeinu Bachya, writes that this image is the capacity, like I just mentioned, of intellectual understanding. It tells us that the intellectual soul within humanity emanates from the Holy Spirit, but rather it refers to an inner nature of a thing, meaning that this is the idea that defines its being and essence. God gave us an ability that rightfully belongs to Him alone, the capacity for understanding, and gave it to us. Physical bodies aren't uniquely human. Animals have bodies too. But there is one quality that sets us apart. It's this cognitive, discerning capacity. The first thing, now, interesting, the first thing that's so important for personal change and for you to be able to change others, we see this with teachers and students, parents and children, friends. A person has to have a healthy, positive self-image. Can you get a better positive self-image than saying, by the way, you created an image of God. God gave you something that He didn't give any other creature in the entire universe. Only you, as part of the human race, have it. Not only would this create a positive image within ourselves, if we truly felt that way about others, even though people may not act as though they understand or appreciate this reality, and we'll get to that, but knowing, when somebody says, look at that animal, unfortunately, sometimes we humans can become animal-like. But the truth of the matter is, they're not animals. They've chosen to be animals. But they've completely ignored who they are at the core. I just saw interesting a commentary on last week's Torah portion. It says that why did Adam call himself Adam? Because he says, I come from the earth. But why doesn't God also know, didn't Adam know he also comes from the breath of God Himself? Didn't Adam know that God fashioned him? Why didn't he have a name that reflected maybe a more superior beginning? Because ultimately Adam understood that the human capacity to ignore everything that's special and unique and divine about them, we can do that. And we could become Adamah, lower than the earth itself. But the first thing people have to understand and appreciate who they are at the core. We can appreciate ourselves and what others are truly like. So that's the first approach. Now, I would like to tell you that a person, even after they appreciate that their cognitive capacity is a divine gift, they don't have, creatures don't have it, only they have this discerning intellectual soul that can perceive things as they should be. I wish that was enough for the human race to behave, but it's not. We know that some of the most sophisticated intellectual people came up with some very appalling ideas, even with good fancy names: eugenics, racism, anti-Semitism. Too many gypsies. If we think for a moment that the message of morality is going to be achieved by simply telling people that they have a godly image, which is nothing more than a unique cognitive capacity, we've already proven that that's not going to ensure a just and moral world. But it's a good place to start, because it's all true. We do have a cognitive capacity that God gave us. We're called Homo sapiens. We understand things. Well, we're meshuggah, but we understand. You know, Chassidus says that while the mind is incredibly good at analyzing, sizing things up, knowing, the pros and the cons, at the core of Hasidic thought in the book of Tanya and elaborated in many discourses, if you decide to become emotionally attached to something, that something becomes so desirous to you, you know what happens? The minds become slaves to the emotion. The minds try to figure out the best way to get what we desire. As you know, that our minds are incredibly capable of going to great lengths to conceive schemes for self-aggrandizement. So just because you have cognitive capacity, that cognitive capacity could easily be under the influence of things where it loses all objectivity. So there's got to be something more, especially if our minds are going to be beholden to our emotions. So what is the key factor here? And the answer is this. We're forgetting one word. You see, we do indeed have an intelligent soul, but it's not the full breadth of and depth of what a godly image means. We said godly image. So we need to add that not only do we have an intellectual soul, we have a godly, divine intellectual soul. What does that mean? If the soul is massaged and exposed in a right way, it knows that it's connected with God. Let me change that word with God with something else. It knows it's connected with something greater than itself. You see, we were endowed with an intelligent soul that, unlike intelligence, appreciates what it means to rise above itself. In our case, to attach to its creator. We always know the famous example that the soul is compared to a candle. And one of the reasons why, for those of you that have heard me over the last, I use it often, that a flame is always, why is that the perfect analogy? Because a flame is always flickering and it looks like it wants to attach itself above. There's always, we see like a little empty space between the wick and the flame sometimes, almost like it's completely looking to completely separate itself. But it's attached because there is a wick. So too is the neshama. The soul struggles. It has a body that it's attached to, but yet it also seeks to be connected to its creator. How does it get connected to its creator? By connecting to something greater than itself. It goes from being self-centered to God-centered. It places itself second. That's what it means that we have a soul that's made in God's image. It has the capacity of self-transcendence. Let me repeat. The capacity of self-transcendence. So I'm going to read something from the Rebbe. He says, the divine image is a result of our godly soul. As such, when influencing our surroundings, the impact is on the terms of our godly soul, injecting transcendence into the intellectual soul. And he says that Maimonides, when Maimonides talks about the Noahide laws, it's probably Maimonides' intention. He's actually probably injecting this idea, reflecting this idea, when Maimonides says, anyone who accepts upon themselves to fulfill these 7 commandments and is precise in their observance is considered pious amongst the Gentiles, has a share in the world to come, and so on. But Maimonides says that this applies only when they accept and fulfill them, because the Holy One, blessed be He, commanded so in the Torah and informed us through Moshe, our teacher, that Noah's descendants has been commanded to fulfill them previously. But one who fulfills them out of pure intellectual conviction is not considered righteous or wise. Why? Because then you're not injecting the divine imagery in your intellectual soul. Maimonides is so insistent that we have to feel a moral obligation to God. Not because, hey, as I mentioned from the get-go, hey, if you start killing people, we're not going to have a community soon. If you start taking what's not yours, there won't be order. There'll be chaos. And with this chaos, you can't have a society. No. You have an obligation to God. It isn't simply a universal morality code. Why? Because if your moral behavior is based on logical considerations, then all that matters is you. And we're trying to get you to the realization that God matters more than you matter. It's the divine in the intellectual cognitive ability of the soul. You cannot, at the end of the day, Jew and non-Jew, achieve our fullest potential without reaching beyond ourselves. Impossible. Can't happen. And that was a message that maybe Noah couldn't get to them. You're not it's not a blame Noah class, but at the end of the day. So even when we influence people with the 7 Noahide laws, it's not only because it makes sense. Wouldn't you like, I always tell people, don't people just want to be happy? Like, what's all the fighting going on? Like when I think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, when you have a child, I mean, unless you're indoctrinated, most people just want their kids to live. Most people just want to like grow old and have fun, no? Now, of course, obviously, if you're faced with people are enslaving you and so, but that's after the fact. Why'd we even get there? Hey, let's be friends. Come to my tent, I'll come into your tent. What's the scoop? You would think that if we could enforce universal laws, then none of that would happen. And that's true. But it's still not a recipe for success. It could last a little bit here, a little bit there, but it's not a recipe for success. Why is not a recipe for success? Because again, you haven't and you're not doing it because it's something that is beyond you, that you're believing something that's greater than yourself. Noah's story is definitely the story, it wouldn't be Abraham's story, that teaches us that we have to be a light upon the nations. We have an obligation to bring morality to the entire world. The Noahide laws provide us with a code to build a just and compassionate society. And the idea that every human being is created in God's image, that's the key to presenting it to people in a relatable, meaningful way that tells them that the only way to make certain that something will stand the test of time is only when you transcend yourselves and cling to something greater than yourself. It's the only way that it works. So obviously, we have to be a light upon the nations, but we have to start with ourselves. We have to start with ourselves by realizing that the things that we do is not because, of course, Hashem wants us to basically have a clear understanding of the meaningfulness of mitzvot and why it's so important and so on. But at some point, we have to realize that when we're created in the image of God, our job is to connect to the divine. That's the only way that we can be certain that that they won't be corrupted when our own minds think differently.